Welcome back now to part 3 of my presentation on the route of the Exodus. In the last presentation, I covered my credentials and purpose. We looked at a question about the population of Israel, and we began the journey and brought it up to the crossing of the Red Sea. In this presentation, we will deal more completely with the crossing of the Red Sea. We'll list additional criteria, and we'll look at various suggested locations for what they call the true location of Mount Sinai. We pick up now where we left off.
This slide shows the suggested route for the first stage of the Exodus. Starting at Avaris, it goes to Succoth, then south to southeast about 50 miles to my suggested location for Etham. Then it turns not quite completely around, bearing west to take them around the northern part of the Gulf of Suez to a point where it would look like they were trapped between the sea and the wilderness. Finally, it crosses the sea to bring the people back into the desert of Etham Shur. This slide represents an alternate idea. Reportedly, the Red Sea level was once higher than it is today. If the sea level had been 12 meters higher, the Red Sea would have extended north into what is now the Bitter Lake Basin. Etham might have been farther north, and the crossing might have happened in the narrow strait between Bitter Lake and the Red Sea proper. Before the construction of the Suez Canal, the Bitter Lake Basin was dry and covered with layers of salt. But the idea that the level of the Red Sea was significantly higher than it is now is not widely accepted. The biblical geographer Emil Kraling wrote, "The discovery of an Egyptian settlement on the coast of the Sinai Peninsula near Abu Sanema has shown that the water level has not risen more than 3 to 6 feet, if at all, in 3,500 years." Unquote. Furthermore, the crossing had to have been long enough for Pharaoh's entire army to be engulfed. Can the biblical place names fit with a Gulf of Suez crossing? Yes. Pi-hahiroth can be translated as mouth of the canal. Ancient writings indicate that Senusret III, who reigned from 1879 to 1839 BC, started a canal from the Gulf of Suez to the Nile, but stopped when he realized that salt water would flow into the Nile and ruin it. But what he did complete became known as the Canal of the Pharaohs. Migdol translates as tower. There were many towers around Egypt as a part of their defensive fortifications. The northern tip of the Gulf of Suez would be a logical place to have a Migdol. Baal Zephon translates to Baal of the North. There were also many Baal Zephon shrines. A shrine atop the mountains to the west would be reasonable. Does the geography fit with the Gulf of Suez crossing? Yes. The crossing must be short enough for all the people to complete it in one night. It must be shallow enough to permit a reasonable descent and ascent. It must be deep enough to drown Pharaoh's army. It must be deep enough to require a miracle. There is a place where the distance across is about 6 miles. If there were 2.5 million people, the path through the sea was 1/8 of a mile wide, that is 660 feet, and the people moved at 2 miles per hour. Then the first in line would cross in about 3 hours. The last in line would finish crossing about 5 hours and 20 minutes later, and the entire crossing would be accomplished in 8 hours and 20 minutes. The maximum depth at that crossing point is less than 50 feet. The approaches to that depth are also gradual. There is wilderness to the west and south to hem them in, and a large enough plain near the sea to accommodate the people before the crossing. A bathymetric chart from 1856 shows the depths at the proposed crossing site. there is a, quote, bridge, unquote, of shallower depth than the regions both north and south of the bridge. A close-in detail of the chart shows a moderate drop to about 45 feet below sea level over the first mile, then a rise to less than 30 feet below sea level at mile 2, then back down to less than 50 feet by the end of the third mile. Then a gently curving route could keep them at the same level for about a mile and a half. Finally, for the last mile and a half, there would have been a gentle climb to the beach. This slide shows an oblique aerial view courtesy of Google Earth. As the people assembled on the point at the left, Pharaoh would have been approaching with his chariots from the upper right. This slide shows a 1/8 mile wide path across 6 miles of sea. The depth of the water is shown by a barely visible dark blue line on the left side of the path. This slide shows the depth of the water as it would look if the entire crossing had been 50 feet deep. Having crossed the northern tip of the Gulf of Suez, the next question is which way from there? South along the Gulf of Suez or east across the Sinai Peninsula? It must be remembered that the people were not yet wandering in the wilderness. They had a prescribed destination, Mount Sinai. The time for wandering did not start until after they refused to go into Canaan from Kadesh. We should look for a route that would be as direct as topography would permit. Note that the Bible lists places between the Red Sea crossing and Mount Sinai. Significant among them is a Red Sea camp after the stay at Elim. The most direct route to Sinai must pass close to some location on the Red Sea. That location could be in one of only 2 places, along the eastern shore of the Gulf of Suez, or at the northern tip or northeastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba. They did not cross the Red Sea twice. The route from the crossing was not just toward Mount Sinai, it was also toward Jethro's home in Midian. After Moses' first encounter with God at Horeb, Sinai, he went to Jethro and from there set out for Egypt. On his way to Egypt, he met his brother Aaron at Mount Horeb. He had not been told to return to Mount Horeb before going to Egypt. Therefore, criterion number 7, Mount Horeb, that is Mount Sinai, is somewhere along the logical route from Jethro's home to Egypt, and Jethro's home is in the same general direction from Egypt as is Mount Sinai, only farther. This means that if Jethro's residence was not in the southeastern Sinai Peninsula, then Mount Sinai must be along a route that goes toward some other location for Midian. But if Jethro's home could have been in the southeastern Sinai Peninsula, then Mount Sinai could have been somewhere between there and Egypt. Criterion number 8. Between the crossing site and Mount Sinai, there must be Marah, Elim, and a camp at the Red Sea. The Bible also mentions Dophkah, Alush, and Rephidim, but the first 3 are more critical for determining a route. These all must be along the way, not on a side trip. Remember, they were not wandering yet. They were going toward Mount Sinai. This Red Sea camp must have been reached no earlier than the 16th day of the 2nd month, a day after they set out from Elim. If the Red Sea or Reed Sea crossing had been over one of the marshy lakes in the Isthmus of Suez, the Red Sea camp could not have been at the same Reed Sea as the crossing. Arguing that the crossing was over one of those lakes would force concluding that more than one body of water is referred to by the same name. There is no evidence that Moses would be using the same name for two different seas in the same narrative without making that clear. The Red Sea camp must be some distance from the crossing site, either south along the coast of the Gulf of Suez or across the peninsula to the Gulf of Aqaba. They traveled 3 days to Marah, at least another to Elim, and at least one more to the Red Sea camp, totaling at least 5 days. If they traveled at an average speed of 1.5 miles per hour for 8 hours each day, that would be at least 60 miles. If the Gulf of Aqaba is meant, then it must refer to the northern tip of that gulf, for there was no second Red Sea crossing. Sinai would have to have been deep into what is now Saudi Arabia, and Jethro's home would have had to have been even farther. If the Gulf of Suez is meant, then Mount Sinai would have to be somewhere in the southern Sinai Peninsula. Jethro's Midian would also have to be somewhere in the southern Sinai Peninsula, for it was in the same direction from Avaris as Sinai, only farther. While conditions could have changed since then, there should be logical sites where Marah and Elim, one naturally bitter, the other sweet, either are or could have been. Are there springs that could correspond to Marah and Elim along the Gulf of Suez? Yes. Are there such springs along the route from the crossing site to the Gulf of Aqaba? Not to my knowledge. That does not mean that there were no such springs along that route 3,500 years ago, just that I can't find any now. The word Marah means bitter. It refers to the bitterness of the water at the spring the word names. There are at least 4 places along the Gulf of Suez that could correspond to Marah. Kyle Delitzsch and Alfred Edersheim both refer to a spring or well that existed in their time that was very bitter. They called it Hawara, but they didn't clearly identify its location. Google Earth identifies a site at 29.346 degrees longitude and 32.943 degrees latitude as Marah, but there is nothing visible at the site through Google Earth that looks like a spring or well. Markers on Google Earth are often wildly misplaced. This location is shown in the upper left on the slide. About 3 miles from the Red Sea crossing site are a number of wells called the Springs of Moses. Some are sweet, some brackish. I do not know when these springs were first referred to as the Springs of Moses. The people of Israel might have made use of these for a day or two after crossing the sea, storing water for the next leg of the journey, but the Bible makes no reference to them. Kyle Delitzsch says that Hawara was 33 English miles from the Springs of Moses. There is something called Abu Murayya about that distance from the Springs of Moses that could be Marah, but nothing identifies it as such. It is shown in the upper right. There is a well about 37 miles from the Springs of Moses called Bir an Nawabi on Google Earth. It is shown in the lower left. There is what looked like it could be a distasteful spring about 39 miles from the Springs of Moses in the lower right. It is about 600 feet long and about 400 feet wide. This slide shows the locations of the 4 possible locations for Marah mentioned here. Each of these locations could be reached in 3 days at a speed of 1.5 miles per hour and traveling 8 hours and 40 minutes per day, or less. While the actual site of Moses' Marah might not be any of these, These are springs that can fit with the biblical text. The Bible indicates that there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees at Elim. Al Delitzsch and Edersheim both identify Elim with the Wadi Garandal. Even today, many palm trees are visible there on Google Earth. This slide presents a Google Earth fly-in to the Wadi Garandal. It is about 7 miles south of the unnamed spring that is one of the candidates for Mara. Because I am making good use of Google Earth, I should say a few words about it. Google Earth is an amazing application, but it is not the same as actually being there. Google Earth images are close to reality, but not exactly reality. Google Earth images are made up of a composite of many different images. Where one image meets another can show up as a color difference along a straight line. Google Earth images make things look drier than they are in real life. Google Earth images round off the sharp edges of jagged rocks and cliffs. The elevation point sampling is too far apart to capture minute details. To have a point sampling closer than it is would make the computer files at Google Earth unmanageable. When the camera records the edge of a cliff, Google Earth often stretches out the image to cover the area that the camera cannot see. The camera can't always see around the edges. Google Earth images are from modern times. The land surface is modeled in 3D, but things on the land, buildings and trees, are, as it were, pasted onto the ground. Google Earth does have a feature for 3D buildings, but that applies for the most part only to very populated areas. Google Earth cannot tell the difference between a tree canopy and the ground. It makes forested areas appear to be higher than they are in reality. The presence of viable candidates for Mara and Elim along the eastern shore of the Gulf of Suez, and the lack of candidates elsewhere within 3 to 4 days of the crossing site, strongly suggests that Mount Sinai lay somewhere in the southern Sinai Peninsula, and that Jethro's Midian is also in the southern Sinai. This by itself does not prove that Mount Sinai and Jethro's Midian are on the Sinai Peninsula, but it favors that conclusion. The 9th scriptural criterion is that there must be 3 different geographical regions, Etham Shur, Steen, and Sinai, between the crossing site and Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai must also be close to the boundary of the wilderness of Sinai, for the people reached the mountain immediately upon entering that region, as Exodus 19:2 reveals. That Mount Sinai was at or near the edge of a wilderness region fits also with Exodus 3:1, where Mount Horeb is described as being on the far side of the desert. In Hebrew, the far side is actually the back side. Akar refers to things that are after and behind. There are 2 possible ways of understanding the back or far side of the desert. It could refer to the far side from the perspective of the desert's relationship to Jethro's home. Moses, having entered the desert on one side, saw the burning bush on the far side. The second way this might be understood considers the Hebrew idiom of associating forward with east. The back or after side, then, might indicate that it was on the west side of the desert. Exodus lists only the desert of Sin and Rephidim between Elim and Mount Sinai. Numbers lists the Red Sea camp, the desert of Sin, Dovka, Alush, and Rephidim between Elim and Mount Sinai. Exodus also places Rephidim after the desert of Sin. Since Exodus does not list the Red Sea camp, it is not clear exactly when the people entered the desert of Sin. The reference in Exodus to the 15th day of the second month could refer to either the day they left Elim or the day they entered the desert of Sin. According to Numbers 33, it wasn't the same day, for the Red Sea camp lay between Elim and the desert of Sin, unless the desert of Sin has both a wider sense that includes the Red Sea camp and a narrower sense that does not include the Red Sea camp. Since Hebrew convention is to date things according to the beginning of an event, it seems best to date the event of leaving Elim and entering the desert of Sin according to its beginning, when they left Elim. They evidently spent many days at Elim. Passover had been on the 14th day of the first month. If they finished the Red Sea crossing as proposed earlier, on the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that would have been the 21st day of the first month. They traveled in the wilderness for 3 days before arriving at Marah, and probably another day from Marah to Elim. That makes 25 days. That leaves 20 days unaccounted for, the last 5 days of the first month and the first 15 days of the second month. A few of those days might have been spent at the crossing site, packing up water from what would later be called the Wells of Moses. The rest of those days would have been spent at Elim. We have already established that Etham Shur was in the northwest portion of the Sinai Peninsula. That leaves the desert of Sin and the desert of Sinai. The biblical record reveals that the people arrived at Mount Sinai immediately upon entering the desert of Sinai. Because Exodus does not list the Red Sea camp, Dofka, or Alush, these locations might be inside the desert of Sin, or Exodus might refer to the desert of Sin in a wider sense, while Numbers refers to it in a narrow, more specific sense. This would be similar to the way the Rocky Mountains are referred to, in both a wider sense, referring to the whole chain of mountains from Mexico to Canada, and in a specific sense, referring to only the Rocky Mountain range of Colorado. There are a number of factors that favor concluding that Mount Sinai and Jethro's region of Midian were on the Sinai Peninsula and not in what is now Saudi Arabia. Earlier in this presentation, we noted that the possible distance from Mount Sinai to Jethro's home can suggest an estimate of the distance from Egypt to Mount Sinai. Remembering that Aaron was coming from Egypt while Moses went first to Jethro and then back to Mount Sinai, we can propose that the distance from Egypt to Mount Sinai was from 2/3 to 3/4 or even 4/5 of the distance from Egypt to Jethro's home. Mount Sinai could have been as far away from Jethro's home as Dothan was from Hebron. If we consider that distance to be about the maximum distance those two places could be apart from each other, it gives a corresponding maximum distance for the Egypt to Mount Sinai distance. If we apply the straight line distance of Hebron to Dothan to the straight line distance from Jethro to Mount Sinai, and we conclude that Aaron traveled more quickly than Moses over that time span, we can make an educated guess that the straight line distance from Egypt to Mount Sinai was from 186 to 248 miles. It could have been slightly more or less, but the lands between these distances will have the highest probability of being the location of Mount Sinai. The distance to Kadesh is also a factor, for the Bible says that it takes 11 days of travel to go from Mount Sinai to Kadesh. How far that would be depends on the rate of travel. But even a slow rate of travel, say 6 miles a day, means there needs to be about 66 miles or more from Mount Sinai to Kadesh. On the map, Mount Sinai would have to be outside the ark, centered on Kadesh. Not only the distance from Mount Sinai to Kadesh, but also the direction from Mount Sinai to Kadesh favors a Sinai Peninsula location. If Mount Sinai had been in what is now Saudi Arabia, the shortest distance to Canaan would have been north, bearing east of the Dead Sea. Kadesh on the west side of the Arabah and of Edom would not have been along the shortest route to Canaan. Regarding the regions, while as someone trained in geography I can make some guesses as to what would correspond to the Desert of Sin and the Desert of Sinai on the Sinai Peninsula, I cannot find features east of the Gulf of Aqaba with which I can make such associations and still have Mount Sinai on the western edge of its desert. The divide between the Gulf of Aqaba and the Persian Gulf watersheds is about 30 miles east of the Gulf of Aqaba. But there is no distinct difference in the appearance of the land at that point from one side to the other. Another 20 miles east, the topography settles down to a dry plain. But once into that region, there are no mountains, even along its western edge. If Mount Sinai were in this region, Jethro's home would have been in one of the most barren regions of the Arabian Peninsula. Finally, if the camp after Elim by the Red Sea had been at the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, why does the Bible say only that it was by the Red Sea and not say that it was at or near Etzion Geber? This location was known and used in the same chapter of the itinerary record. One of the ways to define different geographic regions is by watershed. In some places, the transition from one watershed to another is also the place where one kind of climate or vegetation changes, as is the case with the Cascade Range in Washington and Oregon. To the west, the climate is rainy. To the east, it is dry. In other places, the watershed divides do not correspond to a noticeable change in geography. This is the case in the state of Wisconsin, along most of the divide between the Great Lakes Basin and the Mississippi River Basin. This also appears to be the case in the region where the Exodus took place. For the most part, obvious geographic regions do not closely correspond there with drainage basins. It seems to me that geographic regions in the area of the Exodus corresponded to and would have been named more according to differences in vegetation and topography that would have been more obvious to the people than watershed divides. But I have seen no consistency in how cartographers of the past have assigned region names to locations in Bible lands. Many maps show the Desert of Sin to have been along the coast of the Gulf of Suez. I am suggesting an alternative. This slide applies the Desert of Sin to the rugged mountains of the southern Sinai Peninsula. Perhaps it included all the dark igneous rock mountains all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba, but this graphic stops at the edge of the Suez drainage basin. The area designated as the Desert of Sinai is a guess, prompted by a possible Mount Sinai. The Desert of Etham Shur is a broad coastal plain. Immediately south of Wadi Garandal, which is selected for Elim in this presentation, the topography becomes rougher. Except for a few broad alluvial plains at the mouths of the wadis, it remains rough for about 80 miles. The southern portion of the Gulf of Suez coast is again a broad plain. It might seem a little too convenient to assign the biblical names to geographic regions in this way, but since I have no ancient resource to show something different, I am limited to what the Bible says and must fit these regions to what makes sense with the real-world topography. If the true Mount Sinai was in a different location, then the areas included in the named wilderness regions would also need to be changed. Exodus does not list the Red Sea camp, Dovka or Alush, as Numbers does. As already noted, a possible explanation is that the Desert of Sin was referred to in both a narrow and specific sense, referring only to the dark granite mountains, and a wider general sense, referring to the regions surrounding the Desert of Sin. That could explain why Exodus doesn't list them, for they would have been included in the wide sense of the Desert of Sin. The wide coastal plain on the southwest side of the peninsula might also have been a part of the wider sense of the Desert of Sin. We come now to criterion number 10. The route through mountainous areas must not be over the mountains, but in valleys that are smooth and wide enough for a large group with little ones, aged, and carts or wagons to negotiate in a reasonable time. This should be so obvious that it should not need to be stated, but many who have proposed routes for the Exodus have totally ignored this criterion. For example, an essay by Henny Mouton, published as recently as fall of 2025 on Academia.edu, proposes a route that is at least partially impossible for the mixed group of travelers with their youth, aged, and wagons and carts. I appreciate his effort to be more comprehensive than many others have been, and some of his conclusions are the same as mine. But the Israelites were not birds. Going around a mountain is usually easier than going over a mountain. Further, as already noted, if a passageway is 50 feet wide, it would take 2.5 million people almost 4 days for everyone to pass that point, traveling at 1.5 miles per hour, and almost 3 days at 2 miles per hour. The route I am suggesting has no point narrower than 50 feet, and in most places it is considerably wider. Criterion number 11. Rephidim is close to Mount Sinai. When the people complained at Rephidim about the lack of water, Moses and the elders went ahead to Horeb, where Moses struck the rock. Then they returned to Rephidim, and the Amalekites attacked. I am surprised at how many commentators totally miss this point. Coupled with criterion number 11 are two others. Number 12, the rock of Horeb is at Horeb. Exodus 17:6. It was not some distance away at a point from which Mount Sinai was not even visible. Number 13. Rephidim is downstream from the rock at Horeb. Otherwise, the water from the rock at Horeb would not have reached them. Criterion number 14. The Amalekite attack needs to have happened at a place where it would be logical for the Amalekites to attack. The Amalekites lived in the northern Sinai Peninsula between Havilah and Shur. Numbers 13:29 indicates that they lived in the Negev region, which is south and southwest of Canaan. Some of them also lived in the valleys of the hill country of Canaan at the time, according to Numbers 14:25, 43, and 45. They allied with the Midianites, sacked Gaza, and crossed the Jordan with the Midianites as far as the valley of Jezreel. Judges 6:3 and 33. Pirathon in the territory of Ephraim was in the hill country of the Amalekites, according to Judges 10:15. Except for the time the Amalekites joined the Midianites to cross the Jordan River, all of these places are west of the Jordan-Arabah Rift. Advocates of a Saudi Arabian Mount Sinai propose that the Amalekites attacked in what is now Saudi Arabia, not along the route from Egypt to their preferred Gulf of Aqaba crossing site at Nuweiba Beach. But that route has the Israelites going very near or even through the Amalekites' primary region, as they would have crossed the Sinai Peninsula. If the Amalekites were going to attack, it would be there, not off in Saudi Arabia, after the Israelites had already passed through and left their land. Note, too, that the Amalekites did not meet them head-on, but attacked the weakest at the rear, according to Deuteronomy 25:18. To say that the Amalekites' homeland probably extended into northern Arabia begs the question. What ancient source indicates that the Amalekites' territory extended into what is now Saudi Arabia? Instead of using the historically known area of the Amalekites to help determine the location of Rephidim, the argument uses the opinion that Mount Sinai was in modern Arabia to rule conclusions about the territory of the Amalekites. Criterion number 15. There needs to be space near the base of Mount Sinai for the people's camp arrangement in Numbers chapter 2. This criterion is significant only if Aleph is to be translated thousands and not clans. If Aleph means thousands, the area of land flat enough to camp on would need to be quite large. Criterion number 16. There needs to be space enough around Mount Sinai for a barrier to be placed in a way that can be called a round. It need not be all the way around, but it needs to wrap around at least part way. God told Moses to put a boundary around the mountain, not in front of the mountain. Criterion number 17. Mount Sinai needs to be climbable by an 80-year-old man multiple times. Moses went up and down the mountain 8 times, 3 of them before the 10 Commandments were first given. The narrative strongly suggests that the trip both up and down could have been done in one day. On one of his trips, the elders went part of the way with him. Moses was in good physical shape, even when he was 120. But even a young man will get tired going up and down a mountain. Criterion number 18. There must be a cave and or a cleft somewhere at Mount Sinai. While it might not be visible from satellite images, God put Moses into a cleft in the rock, Exodus 33:22, and Elijah went into a cave when he visited Horeb, 1 Kings 19, verse 9. Criterion number 19. There must be a reasonable path or route that would enable travel to Kadesh in 11 days, Deuteronomy 1:2. There also needs to be a reasonable extension of the path from Egypt to Sinai that leads to Jethro's home in Midian. While the Israelites took longer on the Exodus and Elijah took longer, it must still have been possible for a person to travel from Mount Sinai to Kadesh in 11 days. A large group might travel 6 miles per day or 66 miles. A healthy individual might travel 20 miles per day or 220 miles. Criterion number 20. Kadesh is west of the Arabah. From Kadesh they had to go toward the Red Sea to go around Edom and travel north on the east side of Edom and Moab. Going around something to get to its east side means starting on its west side. Other scriptural references also place Kadesh west of the Arabah. When the spies set out from Kadesh, they ascended by the south and came to Hebron, Numbers 13:22. King Arad, who attacked as the people were leaving Mount Hor, lived in the southern portion of Canaan. Kadesh is included in the locations listed as Israel's southern boundary in Joshua 15:3. All of these indicate that Kadesh was south of Canaan, not southeast or east of Canaan. Criterion number 21. The top of the mountain must be visible from a reasonable gathering site large enough for all the people. Exodus 19 verses 10 and 20. Since the people came out of the camp to gather around the mountain, it might not have been visible from every location in the camp, but it should be expected that it was visible from most of the camp. Now that I have presented a list of criteria that the route of the Exodus and the locations along that route must meet, can we identify a route and locations that meet those criteria? First, I will evaluate some of the more popular or better-known routes that have already been proposed. After that, I will propose a route that I think satisfies the criteria better than the others. It might not be the correct route. There might be a route that satisfies the criteria better. And if someone can make a comprehensive case for a better suggestion, I'll be happy to consider it. I deem it appropriate to start with the traditional Mount Sinai and the routes that would be necessary to and from it. This is an old photograph, more than 100 years old, of a mountain that is commonly regarded as the traditional Mount Sinai. The view is looking basically south. In the valley to the left of the mountain is the St. Catherine's Monastery. This view has often been used by artists. Here is an artist's representation that I remember from my Sunday school leaflets. It seems to be based on an even older artwork dating from 1723. This lithograph by Caspar Louiken is clearly based on the mountain in the photo, and the artist did try to get things right, including the multitude of people and even the boundary around the base of the mountain. But even this art rather over-dramatizes the ruggedness of the mountain. What is interesting about this viewpoint is that the peak of the traditional Mount Sinai is not visible in the image. What can be seen is the northern part of a triple mountain ridge. The traditional Mount Sinai, called Jebel Musa, is the southernmost and tallest of the three peaks of the ridge. The peaks visible in this view are not as tall as Jebel Musa, but they are tall enough to hide it. The high peak on the right is actually Ras Es Safsafa, or Willow Peak. This Google Earth video starts approximately above where the old photograph was taken. It shows the relationship between Jebel Musa, Ras Es Safsafa, and St. Catherine's Monastery. How was Jebel Musa chosen as the traditional Mount Sinai? It was really a product of the times. The last biblical narrative reference to Mount Sinai is when Elijah went there after calling down fire from heaven. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived in AD 70, related that Mount Sinai was somewhere between Arabia and Egypt. He said it was the highest mountain in the area. His report shows that the exact location of Mount Sinai was not known by the Jews of his time, that there was evidence among the Jews before AD 100 that Mount Sinai was somewhere on what is now called the Sinai Peninsula. The proponents of a Saudi Arabian Mount Sinai, either Jebel al-Lawz or Jebel Makla, choose either to ignore or to deny this outright. The mystery of lawlessness that the Apostle Paul reported was already at work in his time had had 2 centuries to develop. The clergy was developing a hierarchical organization patterned after the Roman government. Work righteousness was displacing salvation purely by grace. The veneration of particular Christians of history was distinguishing between ordinary Christians and saints. Because supposedly the works of these saints was more noble or more meritorious than those of ordinary Christians, these saints were at least partially deified. Having many saints to worship was familiar to former pagans who had had many gods to worship. Legends developed about these saints. For example, a legend developed that said the Apostle Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. The pagan idea that certain places were more sacred than others was creeping into the church. Asceticism and pilgrimages were viewed as especially noble and meritorious works and lifestyles. Visions and dreams were given as much credence as the written word as sources of God's messages. The veneration of relics, bones or other remains of a deceased saint or something that had been in contact with a saint had become popular. People believed that these relics had special powers, even healing powers. Some Christians became convinced that it was more worthy to serve God separated from society and started forming monasteries. Some of the monks, especially from Egypt, started during the 3rd century to move into the Sinai Peninsula to live isolated lives dedicated to God. To be as close to God as possible, they would look for places they could believe were holy places. This ascetic lifestyle also took them away from the persecution of Christians that intensified in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, especially under Diocletian, AD 284 to 305.
Hello and greetings. I pray that you found this part of the presentation on the route of the Exodus informative. You can find links to the other 4 parts in the description below, as well as links to other resources. Here you can find a link to the next part of this presentation. The Lord's blessings be with you.